This is the RPG Crawler, and welcome back to my D&D Retrospective, where I take a look back at the history and the systems of each edition of D&D in terms. Now, as a reminder, this is just a layman's look at the various histories. Not going to be a really in-depth thing. If you want more information on the individual history of each individual time period, there are plenty of places to find that. However, I hope this will be a good starting point. Now, we've covered the inception of the game and the founding of an entire hobby, the split between the initial creators of the game and the development of the core rule book format that exists all the way to this present day. Now, after a brief foray into the relatively light-hearted branch of Bet Me D&D, we're going to refocus our attention on the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, specifically the 2nd edition. It began its life the product of upheaval within TSR, saw the development of different playstyles and the proliferation of campaign settings, and ended with the acquisition of the game by another company after TSR's decline. The story of TSR around the lifespan of AD&D 2nd Edition is worthy of an entire video series all by itself, and although I will restrict our overview to just the highlights, an understanding of just what happened can be beneficial in understanding to some degree some of the changes that occurred to the game during this time. In the early 80s, with the development of AD&D and the revision of basic D&D, TSR found itself at the center of a fad. Their product sales were increasing at an incredible pace, one which the company itself had to expand drastically to meet. During this time, the company's organization was loose to the point of being almost chaotic, with creative control still firmly seated with Gary Gygax. However, oddly enough, financial control lay with someone else because Gary Gygax never really had the financial wherewithal to start and run the company up until pretty close to the time he was forced out. While things were going very well, this wasn't really a problem, and a friendly agreement between the shareholders basically kept any interests in the company from being sold to people considered to be non-gamers. However, good times don't last forever, and after a few years of dramatic growth, the bottom effectively fell out of the gaming industry. And all of this during a time when Gygax had turned his attentions to the West Coast and Hollywood, trying to expand D&D into other media. One product of this was the D&D cartoon, and there were talks about an eventual movie, but these talks never truly panned out, at least not at this point in time. This limited Gygax's oversight not only of the economic factors of TSR, but also of its creative direction somewhat. His output declined during these years, although he still had prominent say over production. When he returned to TSR proper, he found finances were in a shambles. Arguably, things may not have been any better if he were still involved in day-to-day operations, but we will never know. It was during this time that Gygax finally worked to acquire financial control over the company, but also sowed the seeds of his own downfall. One of the people he invited into the company was Lorraine Williams, who, while a non-gamer, had two very important qualities. She had a background in business, and she had money from her family. Unfortunately, things did not get any better with TSR's outlook. Creditors were knocking at the door, and Gygax's relationship with his partners had cooled. Part of this was because he was still wanting the company to operate under its gamer roots, while creditors were so important to TSR's continued existence would have preferred otherwise. At the end, Gygax was forced to step down and left the company. So what does this have to do with AD&D 2nd Edition? Pretty much everything, because AD&D 2nd Edition was conceived and published without the oversight of Gygax, and its lifespan was mostly during Lorraine Williams' era of TSR. This era is an odd one to define, because there were underlying problems which eventually resulted in TSR's demise and acquisition by Wizards of the Coast. And yet, this is also the era where the classic campaign settings that we know to today were more or less fully fleshed out, and new styles of adventuring that focused more on story than simple dungeon crawling were developed. It was a transitionary period that resulted in the game maturing, both in theme and in rules development. Now this is going to be a somewhat long look, because there was a lot of product released, and even some core rules were somewhat altered with the eventual addition of the player's option material. Whereas AD&D's first edition lasted a long while with just a handful of expansions, second edition ushered in the era of constant Splat book releases, a tradition which would be refined in the third edition era, brought to a ridiculous extreme in the fourth edition era, before finally being abandoned for a more sedate release schedule in fifth edition. But enough about later editions for now, let's focus on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. Initially, the rules were released in the familiar 3-book format: Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monstrous compendium, this time all in close release order in 1989. Except now, something a little different was attempted with the Monstrous component, which we'll cover when we address that part. We'll start with the Player's Handbook. Designed by David Zeb Cook, with development by Steve Winter and John Pickens, it originally clocked in at 255 pages, and was later somewhat reorganized and re-released as a 320-page black cover book after Wizards of the Coast took over, during which the 2nd edition's branding was dropped for marketing purposes. The contents were pretty much the same, with the main difference in page count rising from the addition of art and changes in typeface. I admit that personally I preferred the older edition with the Jeff Easley cover arts, although this may be nostalgia talking. Unfortunately, my copy is so worn as to be falling apart, so I'll be referencing the black cover version instead. There's a quick introduction that tells what role-playing is, shows an example of play, and offers a glossary of common terms, as well as a step-by-step guideline on creating new characters. This is followed by a section on ability scores and ability score generation. Once more, several methods are offered, and then each ability score is described in detail. This time, ability scores are offered all the way to superhuman levels, up to the godlike area of 25 points, since these may be obtainable during play. Other modifications are the lack of gender differentiation in the scores. Mention of minimum and maximum scores for certain races or classes are left for those particular chapters rather than being tucked into the tables. PC races are then described, and the racial ability score requirements are listed there. Of note is that in the core Player's Handbook, the half-orc has been completely removed from playable races in the 2nd edition, a sign of sanitization during the whole moral panic of the 1980s. Player character classes are then laid out, and here is where things begin to diverge. Character classes have been more standardized, with all level caps running to level 20, and the various classes arranged into groups of warrior, wizard, priest, and rogue. Classes include the fighter, the ranger, and the paladin as warrior subclasses, the mage and the various specializations, of which the illusionist is the only one really detailed out, and then the cleric as well as the druid as examples of specialist priests. Finally, in the rogues, there's the thief and the bard. Notably absent is the assassin, which again has been nixed at this point due to sanitization issues. The bard has been moved from a multi-class requiring advanced classes to a standard single class, although it retains a bit of the flavor of the old first edition one. Balance on the classes has been shifted a bit, although longtime players will probably recognize their main abilities following the same thing they always do. The most notable changes to certain class abilities all have to do with how those classes are customized. As I stated, the illusionist has been moved from its own class with a drastically different spell set and progression to a subclass of mage. This provides a template for other specialist wizards, like enchanters or necromancers. Priest spells have been divided into various spheres, the different levels of access to which defines the different spell lists between different types of priests. It was a little complex, admittedly, but a good start towards setting the stage for specialty priest or priest of different gods. Finally, the thief's skill progression was changed from a flat progression to points that the player got to assign as they wished each level, allowing for players to specialize their characters into different types of thieves. Second edition retains the two-axis alignment system, but goes into a bit more detail on defining each alignment. It also presents the proficiency systems based on non-weapon and weapon proficiencies that were introduced late in first edition in its expansions. They are declared as optional, but are quite robust and offer a good way to customize a character's skill set. Further, although they are considered optional, a large amount of later content in second edition focused on non-weapon proficiency rules and pretty much assumed that you were using them. Money and gear is largely as it was in first edition, except that silver has been slightly adjusted in value. The weapon type versus armor type charts have also been dropped, only to be replaced by an optional rule, later listed in the book, which simply divides weapons into bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing types, versus the various armor types. This serves much the same purpose as the old weapon versus armor types did, and is much simpler to use if it's used, especially considering how much the weapon tables are expanded, especially in later books. The changes to magic largely revolve around the schools of magic and the spheres of priestly magic, which basically boils down, as I said, to standardization and character customization. Wizards still have to roll to learn spells, but there's no longer a minimum learned per level, and the process of learning spells is a little bit more open-ended in general, to allow for the various spell expansions that would come later in the product cycle. The pseudo-Vancian system is still in full force at this point. A section on experience is listed in the player's handbook, although it doesn't go into a lot of detail, but there is enough there to note that the focus on experience has been moved from gathering loot to overcoming monsters and performing quests and getting story awards. The need for training to level up has also been left up to DM discretion. Combat is largely similar to how it was in first edition, with the exception that THAC0 has now been formalized as the shorthand of choice for combat ability determination, and the initiative system has been changed dramatically. Now, initiative uses a D10 and incorporates dexterity modifications as well as optionally speed factor and casting time, and it's a little bit easier of a system to understand than some of the complexities that the first edition initiative had, at least in my opinion. Dual wielding has also been somewhat opened up in terms of what can be wielded in your offhand. Punching, wrestling, and similar styles have basic rules in the player's handbook as well, but honestly they're a bit of a mess, relying on a punching and wrestling table to figure out each individual hit. Much of the rest of the combat is largely the same, and there are rules for each situation in turn. There's a quick section on treasure, which mostly goes into types of treasure, then methods of dividing and storing it, at least in the player's handbook treatment of it. Then there's descriptions of the encounter process in general, simply to get players used to the idea. It mostly goes into the surprise rules and the various options one might consider in an encounter from a player's point of view. NPCs are described, with a focus on followers and henchmen, which serve a similar purpose to what they did in prior editions, but this being the player's handbook, quite a bit more is stated over a player's obligations to their henchmen than in previous editions, which I guess was needed because it was often ignored in those editions, although to be perfectly frank, when we played, it was often ignored in the second edition as well. The rules on vision and light give a good indication of how far a character can see under different circumstances. Time and movement is similar to the prior edition, with rounds being approximately 1 minute long and turns being 10, with a similar switch between yards for exterior measurements and feet for indoor measurements. An oft-overlooked chart there is a basic non-thief climbing rule, allowing a character, any character in the party, to try to climb walls, albeit at a low chance of success. The next 140 pages or so are the expected spell lists and the spell descriptions, taking up a pretty huge chunk of the book as always. Spells are somewhat more detailed than in first edition, and there are more of them, with spells from Unearthed Arcana and other sources now making an appearance as core spells, while a few spells that were just not used very much were dropped entirely. All in all, the second edition Player's Handbook has more information in it than the first edition one, And aside from formatting differences, a number of rules that were once considered for DM's eye only in the first edition were opened up to players in the second edition. Not all of them, mind you, but enough of them to streamline the order of play rather than simply relying on the DM to look up every single chart every single time. And this brings us to the second edition Dungeon Master's Guide. Originally coming in at 192 pages, and it was later released in a black cover version that came in at 256, and it immediately shows you the difference of philosophy between first edition and second edition. Whereas the massive bulk of rules in first edition was in the DMG, to the point where it was nearly twice the number of pages as the player's handbook, in second edition, the player's handbook was larger by far than the Dungeon Master's Guide. While the DM was still the main judge of the rules, a number of the rules had been demystified at this point. Further, a lot of the less heroic minutia rules were removed from the DMG, leaving a book that focused more on heroic adventuring and less on getting sick while in town. Again, I must admit that I preferred the original release of the second edition Dungeon Master's Guide, but my copy again is too worn to use anymore, so I'll be referencing the black cover version. The contents start with a quick introduction to dungeon mastering, followed by a chapter on ability scores. In fact, the organization of the second edition DMG parallels the player's handbook on a chapter-by-chapter basis through most of the book, with the main difference being that the DMG contains some of the non-player accessible rules. The ability score chapter starts with an in-depth examination of the advantages and disadvantages of each generation method, tips for dealing with over- and underpowered characters, handling wishes effects on stats, and dealing with players with multiple characters, as well as developing character backgrounds. The chapter on PC races discusses the effects of including more non-humans in the world, as well as discussing non-human level limits. They weren't listed in the player's handbook, but they are in the DMG. Notably, the level limits in 2nd edition are slightly to significantly more generous than in 1st edition, as is the ability to surpass them with high ability scores. The chapter closes out with a look at creating a new character race. PC classes follows, and that actually starts with a mention of 0-level characters, although only a brief mention, more's the pity. Each class and their place is then discussed in brief, followed by a talk about campaign styles and higher level play, including post-20th level play. Then there's some basic rules for creating an entirely new character class. The chapter on alignment in the DMG is surprisingly long, and goes into various applications of alignment in societies, in specific circumstances, as well as details on changing alignment either willingly or unwillingly. The optional proficiencies chapter is much shorter by comparison, and gives guidelines on avoiding or at least identifying min-maxing and developing new non-weapon proficiencies. The equipment section talks about trade and coinage more than specific items, but it does talk about living expenses, how to drain a character's wealth when they've built too much up of it, as well as what equipment must be available in what time period. There's also some talk about different qualities of equipment, including weapons and specific horse traits that you might get on a subpar horse. Rules for damaging equipment are given, which can be surprisingly useful considering how destructive player characters can be. The DMG Magic section goes into more detail on spell acquisition, spellbook details, as well as spell research. The experience section gives far more detail on awarding experience as is to be expected, including the actual calculations for determining XP for new monsters. There are some optional individual XP awards as well. The combat chapter restates a bunch of the rules found in the player's handbook, although it does go into more detail on actual calculations, as well as more information on what can be done in a particular combat round. Information on morale is given as well, since this applies directly to NPCs, as well as rules for various sorts of poison. There's an optional rule for hovering on death's door or negative hit points, which would go on to become a core rule in later editions. There are also basic rules for unusual combat situations, such as mounted combat, siege damage, and aerial and underwater combat. The chapter on treasure and magic items details them from the DM's point of view, so it goes into methods of placement, but also rules for player creation of magic items if the DM deems it accessible. There are sample rules for artifacts or legendary magical relics, although actual magic item descriptions and treasure tables are left until later in the book. The Encounters chapter actually gives some of the very most useful information in the book. It gives information on creating placed encounters, as well as designing random encounter tables, and is arguably, as I said, one of the most useful chapters. It goes into what you should do in terms of timing checks for encounters, and it gives way more detail on surprise rounds and encounter distance, as well as rules for random encounter reactions if they are needed. Finally, there's guidance for balancing encounters. NPCs and their design are described in detail, with tables showing different medieval professions, the sorts of fields that a sage can study, as well as troop types available. Of note is that soldiery and the like seem to be less detailed in this version than information gathering, which shows, kind of by the by, a shift towards a more storytelling style of campaign and away from the classic wargame-based advancement. Rules for finding hirelings and henchmen follow, as well as for dealing with NPC officials and spellcasters, basically the main types of NPC that a character might interact with. The chapter closes out with details on NPC personalities and traits. Vision and Light chapter is, again, relatively short, but details the sorts of things that one might see with infravision and optional rules of degrees of darkness, slightly better than the binary on-off set of can you see or can you not see that is presented in the player's handbook. Time and movement notably talks more about timekeeping in general, which is a valuable skill that I admit that I am still poor at even after decades of being a DM. The chapter also goes on about overland movement through different terrain and conditions. Finally, there's the classic rules about getting lost to wrap things up there. And at that point, the DMG diverges mostly from the player's handbook, at least in terms of contents. There's a DM's miscellany, which deals with rules that don't really fit anywhere else, such as listening for noises, opening doors, dealing with concealed doors, and then randomly there's lycanthropy and planes of existence tucked in there. Appendix 1 deals with treasures by type, which is similar to the first edition set. Appendix 2 offers tables of magic items for inclusion, while Appendix 3 is actually the description of the various magical items. Many of these are the same classics, although others from first edition supplements have been included as well. The number of magic items available in second edition was thus larger than any of the previous editions, and that basically takes the rest of the book. All in all, the Dungeon Master's Guide is as critical a component for running a game as ever, but it lacks some of the more inane rules, and the reorganization makes it roughly comparable to the player's handbook. The delegation of some of the more commonly used combat rules to the players is useful, and it all combines to really give second edition a bit of a different feel than first, and not just from a mechanics standpoint. It really does feel more like a cooperative game, and as much as I hate to admit it, that might be a good thing, at least where the game was at that point of time. The least changed in internal format, but the most changed in physical format, was, at least at first, the monster books. The main format of the Monstrous compendium, no longer the monster manual, was changed with an eye towards expandability. The core monsters were split into Volume 1 and Volume 2, consisting of 2 large 3-ring binders, along with a folder of loose-leaf, 3-hole punched monster sheets. The initial design was similar to the idea behind the old BX version of D&D, in that as more content was released, you could just add them to the binders. And indeed, at least one Monstrous Compendium appendix was released for each of the major campaign settings, with some getting more than one. Each appendix was a folder with loose-leaf monster sheets, pre-punched to be compatible with the main binders. Where this idea somewhat fell apart, however, was that most sheets had entirely different creatures on front and back, meaning that organization is, as far as an master alphabetical Monstrous compendium was pretty much impossible. Even keeping them sectioned off by campaign setting was somewhat difficult as well, in part due to the relatively fragile nature of the binders themselves. Some people may have had better luck than I in keeping them together, but quite a large percentage of the people I knew that ran the game had the problems of the binders getting ruined or simply not operating properly after a while. Fortunately, this was somewhat alleviated some 4 years later, with the release of a proper Monstrous manual, a hardback like the prior core books that had a decent subset of the existing monsters at that time. Later paperbacks with collections of assorted monsters were then gathered for the various Monstrous Compendium annuals, and a few later Monstrous Compendium appendices were released in this format as well. As for the monsters themselves, the format is very similar to the first edition releases, with a statistic block and a description and usually some sort of illustration. The main differences include entries for climate and terrain to make it easier to place them in encounter tables, organization to give an indication of how an encounter might play out, as well as activity cycle and diet to give an indication about what that monster may be doing at any particular time. There's Thaco, so you don't have to look their attacks up on a chart, morale, and experience value for similar ease of reference. All the other information is largely the same as it appeared in AD&D First Edition, although the descriptions are usually much longer and include details not only on combat tactics, but also habitats and society considerations. Statistically, though, most monsters were quite similar and in many cases can be used interchangeably, although there are a few notable exceptions. High-end creatures tended to get a major boost in their abilities to account for higher party capabilities, at least under the new rule set. Most notably, dragons got a serious buff in 2nd edition. The old references to demons and devils and angels, for that matter, were redone, largely because of the influence of the moral panic of the 80s that had condemned D&D across the board. These monsters were still present, just renamed into the Tanar'ri and Betazu and then the Divas, among several other variations. Aside from these changes, the explosion of monsters during 2nd edition was a sign that things would eventually go this way in later editions. And honestly, it was a development which I admit, somewhat embarrassingly, that I personally enjoyed, as I found the sheer number of creatures to unleash on my players not unlike browsing a buffet, where I could just select what I felt like dishing out at any one instance in time. And that wraps up the look at the core of 2nd edition, except that 2nd edition continued onward with an absolute flood of products in the form of Splat books, compilations, adventures, and campaign settings. Fortunately, these can go over rather quickly. There's the complete handbook series, which covers each class and race in depth and offers additional rules, and in some cases drastically adds more options, such as the complete humanoids handbook, or the complete barbarians handbook that adds an entirely new class. These generally added some minor rules. They had kits that allowed for character customization, as well as additional equipment many times, as well as proficiencies. Then there was the DM's reference series, that offers specific looks and guidelines for different elements of designing campaigns and running games. These were of extremely variable quality, and some of them were very much more useful than others were. The historical reference series, in the green cover, detailed different historical eras, such as the Celts or the Vikings or the Romans, complete with research that was current at that time. Aside from this, there are the various hardbacks. Legends and Lore covers different gods and pantheons, similar to the old first edition deities and demigods. The Tome of Magic offers new spells as well as different spellcasting classes. Book of Artifacts details different major artifacts from the various campaign worlds. The Player's Option series is sometimes called AD&D 2.5 and was an attempt at revising the rules. It consists of 3 books that expand and attempt to reinvent 3 basic sections of the game, while also being backward compatible with existing materials. The Notorious Skills and Powers offers different systems that sit on top of those core rules, including sub-ability scores and a point-by-character creation system that allowed for the complete rearrangement of classes. Spells and Magic involved different spellcasting rules, expanded spellcasting classes, and even more spells, with options given in the classic 2nd edition and skills and powers point buy formats, respectively. Finally, combat and tactics did something similar for combat, and elements of that would later be visible in 3rd edition's combat system, although notably they went away from the crit tables that are offered in the combat and tactics book. The DM's option, high-level campaigns, wasn't really technically part of that series, but it can be lumped in with it. It's the first real core look at running epic or post-20th level games in the main core system. There were many other different accessories as well, but mostly of note were the campaign settings that arose during 2nd edition. The classic Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms had been around since 1st edition, but were really expanded, especially Forgotten Realms in 2nd edition. Entirely new favorites rose as well. Ravenloft was developed into a full gothic horror setting, while Dark Sun offered a sort of swords and sorcery meets post-apocalyptic feel. And there were not one, but 2 intersecting settings designed around encapsulating the others. The first was Spelljammer, which took on an almost space opera style feel, and the second was Planescape. Finally, specialist settings like the Mystara setting that took the old D&D known world and made it into 2nd edition, and the domain-running focused Birthright setting show that there was an attempt to make a setting that fit pretty much every fiction genre. And what did this all result in? AD&D 2nd Edition's era started with a faltering TSR, and towards the end it resulted with TSR failing and Wizards of the Coast acquiring it. AD&D 2nd Edition limped along under Wizards of the Coast care for a few years, though in truth it was mostly to buy time for the release of 3rd Edition. In the year 2000, 11 years after AD&D 2nd Edition hit, 3rd Edition would finally be released, and the TSR name and trade dress, last remnants of the studio created at the inception of D&D back in the 70s, would be completely dropped. The idea of flooding the market with constant, almost untested, and sometimes cheaply produced product did keep TSR afloat for quite some time, while further fracturing its own market, a market that now had to compete with collectible card games as well as other major role-playing game systems. It did result in some of the most beloved and creative additions in the D&D universe, but also a number of false starts. Especially towards the end, just prior to about 1997 and the acquisition by Wizards of the Coast, some of the accessories produced seemed really subpar. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition is sometimes looked upon poorly. People who learned on 3rd Edition and newer often look at it as a bit too old school for them, while a certain number of fans of the 1st Edition look at it as a kind of bastardization of the rules. Because this was the edition I played the most throughout my teen years, I can't really ignore the nostalgia factor. However, I have to say that taken at its core, with just the core books and none of the Splat books, it's actually a pretty good system. It refines and polishes the rule systems evidenced in 1st edition, while allowing more character customization from a rules standpoint, and being generally more player-friendly. The core books do lack some of the harsher rules 1st edition included, but generally make for a more streamlined and easier to learn game for new players. Taken individually, many of the Splat books are also very useful, especially the Complete and the DM's Reference series. However, once you start taking all of the Splat books across the entire library of 2nd edition releases, the system becomes bulky and awkward, inconsistent at best, self-contradictory at worst. It becomes rife with material ready for min-maxing, and it really kind of pioneered some of the worst aspects of modern systems. That having been said, the wealth of material and the quality of some of the campaign settings produced for 2nd edition cannot be dismissed. Some of the adventures developed for it are still some of the most deadly I've seen in print, even exceeding the classic Tomb of Horrors. The focus on story-based campaigning did set the stage for the treatment of role-playing games more seriously by non-gamers, and I believe that, rules and setting bloat and other such flaws aside, it does earn its place in the annals of D&D history, It's an edition that I personally still enjoy running to this day, although I have to make a point when I run it to determine which books I'm going to allow and which books are off the table. Next time, I'm going to take a look at the 3rd edition and the later 3.5, as well as the rise of the D20 SRD. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with my D&D retrospective covering AD&D 2nd edition. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye.